Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar called Government Restrictions Are Gone, Now What? Although, of course, since we made that title, the government restrictions aren't quite gone. There are many familiar names on our attendee list today, so for those of you who know me, hello. For those of you who don't, my name is Christine DeWitt. I'm the Director of Client Relations here at Reynolds Murph, and I'll be facilitating the session. You'll see me a bit at the beginning and at the end. We're really pleased to have a fantastic crowd with us today. We have folks from all over the province and actually a number of folks from throughout Canada. So welcome to everyone. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items really briefly before we get started. We're scheduled to go for 60 minutes, thereabouts. If you have to leave us early, no problem at all. When the session is done, you can use the same link that you used to log into the session to view a recording. So that will just be up forever, so you can use it whenever you need to. Below where you're seeing the videos, you'll find the Q&A function on your console. Please use this to submit any questions that you might have. Depending on the questions and our pacing, we will be checking those questions periodically throughout the presentation. And it might be that we keep some questions for the end, but please do submit your questions so that we can see them. Another tool is the chat function. It's at the bottom, and it's called chat, easy to identify. We won't be monitoring that for questions, but do feel free to use it to chat with one another if you'd like to do so. But questions in the Q&A, please. On the top right-hand part of your console, there's a section called Download Your Materials section. There you'll find a PDF of the slide deck that we use today, and we've also created a takeaway for everyone called Sick Leave Policy Best Practices Drafting Tips. So be sure to click on that and save yourself a copy of those drafting tips. All right, on to the speakers. Today you're going to be hearing from three folks at the firm. Matt Woodley is a partner at the firm, and I'm sure many of you know him and have worked with him. Matt has extensive experience advising employers on a wide range of topics, and I think over the last year and a half, he's probably talked about everything and anything that might affect an employer when it comes to COVID, so we'll hear from Matt. Matt will be joined by Lauren Shalternick, who's an associate at the firm with a busy employment practice as well. If you've attended past webinars, Lauren is likely another familiar face to you. And joining us is Madison Croden, who's an articling student who joined the firm earlier this year after completing her articles with the Court of Appeal. So there is a lot to discuss on this topic. Things are changing quickly. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
Great. Thanks very much, Christine. Thanks to everyone for attending today. I keep hoping that we'll be able to offer a webinar that does not relate to COVID-19. I think we've all been waiting for that for a long time. We're not quite there yet. And the impetus for this seminar really was when the government of Alberta announced the removal of restrictions and the existing public health orders, including, I think, importantly, the requirement for self-isolation. And as most of you know, if you're in Alberta, that was going to take effect this past Monday. And that was a change that, since we conceived of the idea of this particular webinar, the government has delayed. So it has given a bit of breathing room to organizations to look at this issue again, and I think it's a good opportunity for everyone to be thinking about it. Really, when I raised the issue of wanting to provide some additional guidance about these issues, the focus is on the difficult position that this puts employers in Alberta. So there's various obligations, as all of you are well aware, that employers have. We're going to touch on some of those today, including occupational health and safety, privacy, and human rights. And the removal of the government restrictions really places a stronger and higher onus on employers to try to grapple with many of those issues. So as I said, the changes that we had anticipated originally coming into effect on the 16th of August have been delayed till September the 27th. But what we do know is that those changes are coming. And most starkly, from an employment perspective, will be the fact that individuals who have COVID-19 will no longer be required to self-isolate. And what that means from an employment perspective is that they will not be prohibited by law from coming into the workplace. And for the past 18 months of the pandemic, of course, employers could rely on the fact that there was a legal requirement for individuals to self-isolate in particular circumstances, and it really was beyond the control of the employer to deal with those situations. Now, with those restrictions scheduled to be lifted in the coming weeks, employers really need to be thinking about how to articulate the rules for their own individual workplace to protect themselves, to protect other employees, and of course, other stakeholders, including customers and clients. The other factor that really encouraged us to put on a seminar about these issues is that things are not always getting better with the pandemic. We have the Delta variant, and there is news coming out about the ability for vaccinated individuals to transmit the virus, breakthrough infections for vaccinated individuals, the reduced efficacy of vaccinations over time, as we're seeing in some jurisdictions like Israel and elsewhere, issues around long COVID, and the potential need for booster shots. So all of this is creating an environment with a great deal of uncertainty. And in my experience, I complained to a couple of my colleagues today that I haven't sort of seen this much anxiety from an employer's perspective relating to COVID-19 since the very early days of the pandemic in sort of March, April, and May of 2020. So I hope that you'll get some benefit from the topics that we're going to be discussing today, and that really it will cause you to be looking at your organization's practices and policies with respect to this to get ready for the lifting of these restrictions down the road. For those of you who are attending from outside of Alberta, the focus of this seminar is going to be very much on the situation in Alberta, requirements under Alberta law, but of course there will be similar issues that will arise in other jurisdictions as well. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, first of all, we're going to look at the changes from a legislation perspective. What is being changed in Alberta? What has changed recently? We're then going to look at what the occupational health and safety obligations are. And this is being dealt with sort of as a separate topic because it really is an important point for employers to keep in mind moving forward, not only with respect to sort of dealing with the transition away from the public health orders and understanding the basis for the obligation for employers to be doing something about COVID in the workplace, but also to ensure that we are all on a common ground with respect to why these changes have to be made and the risks that arise from it. So we'll talk about workplace restrictions, that is the kinds of things that employers can put in place to deal with those issues, and the consequences if you don't do that down the road from an occupational health and safety perspective. We'll then deal with sick leave and encourage everyone to take a look at your sick leave policy to the extent that it exists. If you already have it, of course, it needs to be checked to deal with COVID-19. And very importantly, as I said before, to actually create a rule that an individual who has been diagnosed with COVID can't come to work, because remember that legal prohibition is going to be lifted in the coming weeks, as far as we know now. And then we'll talk about the issue of rapid and other testing and what organizations should be thinking about if they are wanting to utilize rapid testing as a part of their toolkit to deal with these risks in the workplace. And particularly if you're looking at imposing a policy with respect to vaccines or with respect to testing. If you're following the news at all, you will note that there are a number of organizations, government and otherwise, that have recently announced a requirement for vaccinations or a requirement for testing in the event that an individual does not have vaccination. So we'll talk about some of the practicalities dealing with issues around testing. So you're going to hear from me, unfortunately, for most of the presentation, but Lauren and Madison are going to chime in on a couple of these points. And please feel free to add any questions that you have as we go. And I'm hoping that we'll leave some time at the end to deal with everyone's questions. If not, you always can feel free to reach out to us with anything that hasn't been addressed in the presentation. So let's turn to the legislative changes. So we're going to break this down into two segments. The first one were changes that took place on July the 29th. And those dealt with the removal of certain public health order aspects. So, for example, quarantining for close contacts of individuals who test positive for COVID is no longer mandatory, it's recommended. Contact tracing is no longer notifying close contacts about exposure to COVID-19. In the event that there are outbreaks identified Certain organizations like daycares and schools will be supported with measures that would be effective for any respiratory virus. And asymptomatic testing and testing for individuals with mild symptoms will no longer be recommended. So we already have seen some changes with respect to how public health officials are dealing with COVID-19 in Alberta. And as I said before, the other change that we believed was going to take place on the 16th of August has been delayed until September 27th. And these are important ones, and these are the ones that are scheduled to come to an end as of that date. So mask use for public transit, including rideshare vehicles, taxis, and buses will no longer be required. However, it's anticipated that businesses and municipal governments will be free to set masking requirements if they think that it is appropriate to do so. Importantly, if an individual tests positive for COVID-19, that individual will no longer be required to self-isolate, but it will be strongly recommended. And isolation and other quarantine support mechanisms, for example, quarantine hotels and other financial supports, will no longer be available since that self-isolation period will no longer be mandatory. And public testing will only be available for individuals with symptoms when it is needed to direct patient care decisions. So Albertans with mild symptoms that don't fall into that category will not generally be tested. And testing is going to be available through care settings as opposed to the sort of high volume testing settings that we've been used to over the last few months. So that's a snapshot of the changes that have been put in place and that are coming. But it's important to keep in mind, as we've seen many times over the past 18 months, that these things can change and that they can change based on what we're experiencing with COVID-19 numbers, hospitalizations, and of course, individuals who are admitted to ICU. So it's very important that you continue on behalf of your organization to check the government COVID website as we move closer to the end of September to get an accurate picture of when these restrictions may be lifted. And of course, it's always possible that some will be lifted in certain locations and will be maintained in others. But the important takeaway here is that the province's approach now is that we need to learn how to live with COVID-19 in the community as we would with any other respiratory illness. And so it is essentially a transition from a pandemic COVID to an endemic COVID, where it will circulate in the population as it would with other respiratory illnesses, such as influenza. And that really requires a shift in the mindset that we have in how we've dealt with COVID in the past and the resources that employers will have available to them as we move forward. So turning to the health and safety obligations that employers have, and it's important to have our grounding in terms of what the legal obligations are as we're looking for options for how employers can deal with these issues. But as everyone knows, the Occupational Health and Safety Act places a number of obligations on employers for maintaining a safe and healthy work environment. So there's a general obligation in the Occupational Health and Safety Act to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure the health and safety of workers. And recent amendments to the Occupational Health and Safety Act include additional obligations, not only on the employer itself, but also with respect to supervisors. So supervisors have a general duty to take reasonably practical steps to ensure the health and safety of individuals who they are supervising. And workers also have an obligation to take reasonable care to protect themselves and their fellow workers in the workplace. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, aside from those general obligations, provides the Occupational Health and Safety Department a great deal of ability to provide guidance documents with respect to how it will administer the Act. And as of July the 1st, so a relatively new development in the COVID world, Occupational Health and Safety has determined that COVID-19 is a workplace hazard. So what this means is that in accordance with the Occupational Health and Safety Code, employers are required to review and update their hazard assessments having regard for the circumstances as they change over time. So some factors that are going to be considered in looking at COVID-19 as a workplace hazard will include any recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, so pay attention to recommendations coming from public health officials, the existence of any active cases at your own work site, so sort of the facts on the ground in relation to what's happening in your workplace. Active cases in your region will be an important thing to keep in mind. The number of workers that you have who are vaccinated, if that information is available to you, the existence of people in your workplace who have health vulnerabilities. So if you have individuals who have medical conditions that make them more vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus, or if you have individuals in your workplace who cannot, for medical reasons, get vaccinated, they may have a greater risk, which you need to keep in mind when you're doing your assessments of risk in the workplace. The way in which your workers interact with members of the public. So if you're in an office like me where you can close the door and you don't have much interaction with your coworkers, compared to a situation where you have your frontline workers who may be required to interact with members of the public on a regular basis, or who may be required to deal with particularly vulnerable segments of the population. It's another factor that has to be considered. And of course, issues like physical distancing in the workplace, the kinds of work activities that are being performed, and any other controls that you may have the ability to implement. So all of those things need to be considered in the context of assessing the hazard in the workplace presented by COVID-19. So Occupational Health and Safety has provided some guidance with respect to this issue, and there's a guidance document set out on the Occupational Health and Safety website. They identify a hierarchy of controls that can be put in place by employers to deal with this risk. The first one is engineering controls. So these are ways in which the employer can control the risks or the hazard at the source. And very interestingly, from an employer's perspective, they identify vaccinations as an engineering control. So it's sort of the gold standard is an engineering control which would eliminate the risk at its source, and vaccinations is an important one to keep in mind. There are also administrative controls. So that's the way you change how people are working. That deals with hand washing, social distancing, workplace cleaning policies, and physical barriers. And then personal protective equipment, so dealing with masks and gloves, eye protection, and those sort of things where you empower the individual to be taking precautions for their own physical body. So given that vaccinations have been identified by Occupational Health and Safety as I say, the gold standard for mitigating the risks associated with workplace injuries and illness, it's very important that employers review their policies with respect to vaccinations or with respect to communicable diseases if you have one in the workplace. And you need to be thinking about how vaccination policies might fit into your overall plan to reduce the risk of transmission in the workplace. Occupational Health and Safety says very specifically, before you think about a mandatory vaccination policy, there are legal risks that have to be considered, and they recommend that employers seek legal advice about those matters. And it's important to keep in mind that appropriate policies dealing with vaccinations will depend on the workplace. But it's important to keep in mind that there is an occupational health and safety basis to indicate that vaccinations may be required in the workplace because they are identified as a way in which to control the risk of transmission and therefore to ensure that you're providing a safe and healthy work environment to your employees. So we can talk a little bit more about mandatory vaccination policies, but the point of this slide is really to communicate that we now have to shift focus to be thinking about COVID-19 as a job hazard. And if you have your job, your joint health and safety committees under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, they should be considering this. And you need to be demonstrating how you're going to be dealing with those risks in the workplace. There are other risks aside from the direct transmission of the virus that you will want to be thinking about. So psychological hazards for employees returning following a pandemic. I think we're seeing more issues around mental health concerns, anxiety disorders that are being reported, and the need for workers to have an opportunity to sort of reintegrate into the workplace if they are being brought back in to the workplace after an extended period of absence. So in terms of mitigating the overall risks in the workplace, organizations should be thinking about supporting staff to stay away when sick. So that can include flexible work-at-home arrangements and unpaid leaves of absence, regardless of the length of service. So if an individual is sick, think about how you're going to be able to deal with that situation to ensure that you're not creating a risk for other individuals in the workplace. Make sure that you're looking at your corporate policies, defining what staff who may be ill with one of the symptoms of COVID are required to do in terms of staying away from the office. Employers can provide resources or links to resources to employees with respect to vaccines and their roles in workplace health and safety. Continue to encourage the use of good hand hygiene and sanitizer in the workplace, following respiratory etiquette, and limiting the number of people in small indoor spaces continues to be important. So even though we have the message coming that in some ways the pandemic is over, the occupational health and safety obligations will mean that all of those good processes that you put in place during the height of the pandemic may still need to have a place in the transition now that we are in with COVID as a job hazard. So important, if you haven't already done it, treat COVID as a job hazard. Think about the ways in which you're going to reduce the risk of transmission in the workplace. And remember that ultimately you want to be able to show occupational health and safety what you did to address that risk down the road. So just like any other occupational health and safety issue, you need to be able ultimately to justify what you did and why you did it in order to reduce those risks in the workplace. So Lauren, do you want to address some of the restrictions that employers need to consider when they're moving through this process?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So kind of going off now again of Matt's comments about the health and safety obligations, because there is this fairly significant requirement on employers to ensure that they're upholding these obligations. This means that the OHS Act and those obligations support the imposition of restrictions, even where the provincial government or the federal government in some situations has not necessarily mandated or legislated certain things. So even where we're going into a time where employers and businesses don't necessarily have direction from the provincial government, and they can't necessarily lean on legislation to justify the imposition of restrictions, that doesn't mean that those restrictions can no longer be in place. Again, this is really because of those occupational health and safety obligations. That being said, the restrictions that go in a workplace really depend on the nature of the workplace. So, we've talked about vaccinations a lot, but I think that's sort of an easy one to talk about, is that there may be certain workplaces where vaccinations and mandating vaccinations is not appropriate because there are other measures that maybe don't impact, the privacy and human rights of an employee as much, that can be used that will still accomplish those health and safety obligations to the extent that is required. So when, as an employer, you're considering the restrictions that you may now need to put in place or keep in place, you may already have them, it's important to consider things like how many people are in my workplace, the size of the workplace. As Matt identified, can I be behind a closed door? Can I be behind physical barriers? I think a classic thing to think about is whether employees can be working from home, or is it a workplace where something like that isn't really possible, and so other measures need to be put in place to address those health and safety obligations. So again, one of the, before we kind of go into the specifics of the restrictions, it is important that when restrictions are being put in place, that they are in a policy, and that that policy does include some type of purpose statement or justification for why those restrictions exist. And again, even without direction from the provincial government, I think employers leaning on their general health and safety obligations and potentially direction from other organizations, like the World Health Organization, like the federal government, and the chief medical officer of health, anything that kind of comes from authoritative organizations can be used to justify some of the steps that employers are taking, again, even without direction from the provincial government. So the restrictions, like we said, largely will remain the same if they're necessary. So it's things like masking, social distancing, vaccinations where appropriate, working from home. I think one of the significant ones now, because it's no longer provincially, or will no longer be provincially mandated, is that if it makes sense in your workplace to require that employees stay home when sick, with any symptoms, any respiratory symptoms, and again, that may be up to you as an employer to set out what those symptoms are and the policy and procedure that you want in place for isolation. That is something that employers may need to put in place in order to ensure that their health and safety obligations are being upheld. Is they may need to say, look, even though the province is no longer requiring this, we are, because we need to ensure that everyone is safe. I would say this is especially the case, even if, I'm kind of anticipating a potential question is, what if my entire workplace is vaccinated? You may still need to have an isolation requirement because of some of the science that's coming out to say that transmission can still occur. You don't know whose family, there may be members of employees' families that aren't vaccinated. And again, it's important to just sort of ensure that kind of catching all of those potential issues when considering whether isolation is required, even in a context where you're fairly confident that you have a workplace where everyone is vaccinated. So again, I would say, like it has been for a number of months, these restrictions remain appropriate, again, as long as they're justified by the health and safety obligations that apply to your workplace and are specific to the nature of your workplace. But it's just important that they're in a policy. They're clearly articulated. If policies need to be updated going forward because they relied very heavily on legislation, those updates may need to be made. And so I think now that there's a little bit of wiggle room before those restrictions are dropped, I think it serves as a bit of a good advance warning to employers that now is probably a good time to start thinking about making those adjustments, taking those considerations, and determining whether those restrictions need to start being put in place or changed in any way to ensure that, as we've said, those health and safety obligations that you are still held to as an employer are being upheld. So another question that we've anticipated, and I'm going to pass it off to Madison for this, is that there may also be some workplaces that say, well, what happens if I don't want to impose any restrictions? I don't feel like I need to, and what are the potential consequences of that? So I'll pass it off to Madison.
Thanks, Lauren. As Lauren said, I am going to be addressing what happens if you don't want to impose workplace restrictions, or you might not feel like they're necessary for your workplace. And it is certainly possible to choose not to impose restrictions in your workplace. However, if you do choose to do that, you run the risk that that decision will be seen as an occupational health and safety violation. And as Matt has helpfully outlined for us today, there are a number of obligations that employers will still be required to comply with under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and those obligations could be impacted by the decision to have a restriction-free workplace. For example, things like the general duty to ensure the health and safety of workers. Additionally, employees also have a right under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to refuse unsafe work. So if you do have a workplace with no restrictions and you have an employee that is particularly vulnerable, perhaps they're immunocompromised or they have other underlying respiratory illnesses, that employee may be well within their rights to refuse your work as being unsafe work. So these are just a couple of the difficulties that you might run into and a couple of the things that you'll have to weigh in determining whether you should impose restrictions in your workplace and what those restrictions should be. And to just help conceptualize what this risk is in terms of compliance or non-compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if there is an investigation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and that investigation determines that there has been a violation, an employer can be subject to an order to relatively severe monetary penalties or even to prosecutions under the Act. So these will be things that you need to weigh in terms of a risk-benefit analysis or a risk appetite in determining what sort of restrictions you'd like to impose. Now, having said all of that, a big caveat on some of these risks is the nature of your workplaces. And this is something that both Lauren and Matt have touched on. So a restriction-free workplace, which respects your obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act as an employer, may be possible where the nature and circumstances of your workplace allow for that. So for example, if you are in a workplace with a mandatory vaccination policy and your employees have complied with that policy, so you have high vaccination rates in the workplace, that might be a case where you could remove restrictions without any of these difficulties or with less of these difficulties, because the chances of somebody getting seriously ill from COVID-19 in your workplace is much lower than it otherwise would be. So in short, the choice with imposing restrictions is yours, but you must be aware of the potential risks of that decision and the circumstances of your workplace. So with that, I will just pass it back to Matt now, who's going to be discussing sick leave policies.
Right. Thank you very much, Madison. And before I get to that, I think the upshot of what we're talking about here is simply because the province has lifted restrictions does not mean that employers can have a restriction-free workplace. You need to be thinking about COVID-19 as a hazard in the workplace and taking steps to deal with that hazard in accordance with the particular facts that you have in your workplace. So let's talk about sick leave policies, because this is something that many employers have asked questions about, given what we've talked about already. So remember, without being able to rely on the legal requirement for self-isolation coming from the public health orders, employers have to figure out how they're going to deal with preventing transmission in the workplace and dealing with the situation of employers legally being able to come to the workplace even if they're sick with COVID-19. So the very first step, you will have heard this from us many times over the past 18 months. The very first step is looking at what your existing policies and procedures say in relation to sick leave and if they exist with respect to the pandemic response. So if you go to your shelf and blow the dust off your policy book, look for your sick leave policy, and then hopefully your pandemic policy that would have been put in place about this time last year won't have that much dust on it, but you need to be looking at both of those things together now. And ask yourself, do these policies specifically require employees with certain symptoms or with confirmed transmissible illnesses to stay at home? And, classic example of any workplace is the individual who thinks that they are a hero for coming to work sick because a cold's not going to keep them from coming and doing work. And it's not uncommon in the past anyway for people to come to work and say, oh, I've just got a cold, but I've got this thing that I've got to do. Well, that's because even if you had a policy that required people to stay away from work when they're sick, it wasn't enforced. So look at what your policy says. Does it contemplate that individuals have to stay home? Does it contemplate that they have to advise the employer if they're suffering from a certain symptom? And importantly, does your policy contemplate disciplinary action if an employee comes to work while they are sick? So not only important for you to look at what your policy said, even if you think, oh yeah, my policy is pretty good actually, it was put in place recently, it has these certain requirements in it. It's very important to ensure that you are looking at it again and communicating the contents of the policy and the consequences for non-compliance to your employees. So it's not enough that you have the policy, even if they signed off on it a year ago, strongly recommend that at some point in the very near future, you remind your entire workforce about what your policy says. If it's a new policy, make sure that you have evidence that they have seen it and have indicated that they've read it. And also that it's clearly communicated that there are consequences for them for not complying. If you're dealing with a unionized workforce, of course, you will have to look to your collective agreements to make sure that there isn't a requirement for notification to the union with respect to the development of new policies. Follow your collective agreement. In a non-unionized work sector, you generally speaking have the ability to create workplace rules, but it's very important when you come to enforce it that you're able to show that individuals were actually aware of it. So your policy should also consider what will happen when an individual says that they can't come to work because they're sick. Do you have a sick leave program where, for example, employees will bank sick time over the course of a year? Make sure that if you do, it's clear how that's going to be accessed. What about the situation where individuals have no sick vacation time, so they don't want to have a reduction in pay? Will you allow them to use accrued vacation time? And remember, as we've learned over the past 18 months, many employees can actually do their job fairly well remotely. So it may be an alternative for you to ensure that your policy contemplates that the employer may permit an individual who can't come to work because they are either sick or because they have a symptom that prohibits them from coming into the office. Those individuals may be permitted the flexibility to work from home where the need arises. Your policies should continue to allow the employer to make adjustments to the employee's working conditions. That includes the physical location of the work being done, requiring employees to social distance, to use personal protective equipment, including masks, as a backstop to ensure that you're reducing transmission in the workplace. Those are requirements that you will want to have in your toolkit for many months to come, and you want to make sure that any policy that you're putting in place doesn't make those requirements that would have been in COVID pandemic policies disappear. So think about what's going to happen to an employee who it can't come to work because they're sick, and make sure that you are getting the policy language clearly communicated to your employees in advance. So as Christine said at the beginning, we have provided a bit of a handout on sick leave policy best practices. This is not a fully drafted sick leave policy. Let me make sure that that is on the record. These are a couple of snippets of different approaches that can be taken in policy. So this is some language that you may want to use. And we've dealt with some of these already. But the first one, and probably the most important, is a very clear, very well-articulated expectation around what employees who may have COVID or who have in fact tested positive for COVID are required to do. So that's something that definitely has to be in your policy. We've also recommended that you include a why or a purpose statement. So it's important in this policy, what are you trying to accomplish through the sick leave policy? And obviously it's the protection of your workers through a safe and healthy work environment, and the promotion of compliance with best practices from a public health perspective. My advice in relation to these policies, and also policies that might touch on vaccination issues, is that you underline and bold all the requirements dealing with occupational health and safety. Because remember, if you have a challenge to one of these policies down the road, you will want to make it very clear that there is a particular risk that you're looking to address because you have a legal obligation to do so under the occupational health and safety legislation, and that is the policy rationale for requiring vaccinations or masking or rapid testing. And we'll come to that in a minute as well. Have a clear language with respect to sick leave usage. Your organization may not have sick leave, so think about whether or not you'll give the option for individuals to take vacation time or unpaid leave time, and deal with issues around non-compliance. So what are the consequences if an employee breaches the policy? Given the significant risks for an employer from COVID-19 in the workplace, you have to make it clear that non-compliance with the policy will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination for just cause. And you can probably tell I've written that phrase a lot lately because it just rolls off the tongue, but it's very important that it be in your policy book. So that's the focus with respect to sick leave policies. I'm going to touch briefly on the issue of testing, because this is something that is becoming more common in terms of requests from employers about what to do in testing. And we've seen some large organizations in the province have a requirement not necessarily focused on mandatory vaccinations, but mandatory rapid testing for those individuals who have chosen not to get a vaccine. This is a developing area, and of course it's developing principally because we know that the province is going to be and has been reducing the circumstances in which they will allow a COVID test to take place, and that ultimately there will not be testing for symptomatic cases down the road as we move to an endemic approach to COVID-19. So if you're going to require testing, you need to make it clear to employees when and why testing is going to be required. That is, what are the circumstances that will arise that will allow the employer to require that employees participate in rapid testing. A very big issue is who is going to pay for testing. So my understanding is that rapid testing right now comes in at somewhere in the range of $40 per test. Don't quote me on that number. It's not a guarantee, but it's not an insignificant amount of money if you're thinking that you have a large workforce who may need to be tested on a fairly regular basis. And while it is probably the presumption that employers will be paying for this test if the employers are the one requiring it, think about circumstances where employees put themselves in a situation where testing may be required. So for example, if an individual travels outside of the country, travels to a place where there may be a COVID-19 outbreak at the time, will they be required to pay for testing in those circumstances? So are there limits to the circumstances in which the employer is going to be paying for testing? Will there be limits on the number of tests that the employer will pay for? Are these going to be rapid tests, or will this be full PCR testing, which of course has to be done in a different setting? And really importantly, and something that people don't think about because it's not the sort of thing that you have to set out in your policy, but you need to be thinking about where are you going to do this testing? Like what organizations are you going to be accessing that will allow you to actually say to an employee, you've got to go and get a test. Here's where you go. Because many employers will not want to be in a position where they're actually administering the tests themselves, and individuals may have to be directed to a particular location or a lab to actually undertake those testing, those tests. So having that done in advance, contacting testing companies that may be close to you geographically, will avoid some of the delays which might come in the event that you decide we have to get this employee tested, and therefore we have to start from scratch to figure out how we're going to do it and where we're going to send them. So testing issue that is coming up, it's worth thinking about as you are dealing with some of these issues. I wanted to touch on the question around mandatory vaccination policies. This is a question that has come up in our Q&A section quite a bit, and it's not surprising because, of course, there's a lot of news these days about organizations that are implementing mandatory testing, including federal government and federally regulated employers, private organizations, and municipal organizations as well. Generally speaking, as I said before, the underlying rationale for requiring testing really does come from the occupational health and safety basis. So because occupational health and safety has said that COVID-19 is a workplace hazard and has identified vaccinations as an engineering control, that is that highest level of control in the workplace, there is at least a rational basis for the employer to require that employees are subject to full vaccinations. There are legal risks that come with that sort of policy, and we've seen comments with respect to those in the news. The primary one that everyone has to keep in mind are human rights exemptions. So if an individual is medically unable to get a vaccine for one reason or another, they cannot be discriminated against, because that would be discrimination based on physical or mental disability, and it's prohibited by provincial legislation. So any mandatory policy has to build in a process for dealing with exceptions to it. And the policy also needs to make sure that it sets out the fact that where an exemption is granted, the employer does have the ability to impose additional rules that would still address the risk of transmission in the workplace. And that can be, for example, rapid testing. It can be issues with respect to masking and other personal protective equipment, or potentially working from home. Privacy issues come up in this as well, because of course employers are going to be gathering personal information of their employees. So you have to be thinking about the way in which you're going to protect that personal information that's being gathered, and ensure that you are acting in accordance with your organization's privacy policy, whether that's under the Personal Information Protection Act governing the private sector in Alberta, or whether it's under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act governing public bodies. And then another issue that has come up quite a bit with organizations that are looking at implementing some sort of vaccination policy, whether it is a rapid testing policy or a mandatory vaccination policy, is where you have individuals who are exempt, and where you're requiring them to remain masked while other people in your workplace are not. How are you going to deal with the possibility that those individuals will feel singled out as a result of wearing masks in the workplace? And my general advice has been that organizations should allow people to remain masked if they're comfortable to do so, and that generally speaking, individuals should not necessarily be asking a bunch of questions of their coworkers with respect to why they've made that decision. So I'm just going to turn to some of the questions in the chat, because I think that we're at the end of our slides, and we've got about another 10 minutes. So one of the first questions is, how will the mandatory vaccination policy and recently been put in place, and the example here in the question is the town of Banff, potentially affect other organizations and municipalities? My answer to that really is that there has been a movement, I would say, over the last couple of weeks in organizations to look at mandatory vaccination policies. I think that's clear just on the reporting that we've seen from organizations federally, as well as locally, and of course private businesses. So it will not have a direct legal impact. What one organization decides to do, generally speaking, is based on the particular circumstances that exist for that organization. But it may indicate that there are organizations that have determined that in order to satisfy their obligations under occupational health and safety legislation, they need to put in place a policy that requires mandatory vaccinations. So I would say that it is something that organizations across the board are considering, and particularly given the situation that we're in Alberta with increased case numbers, it's likely a conversation that is going to have a continued impact. Similar question is, will the federal employee mandatory vaccination approach have a trickle-down effect on employers throughout Canada? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, it already has. I think individuals and business owners, for example, are re-examining their original approach to it, to at least gather information with respect to the number of employees that they have who are vaccinated. And so when you see some guidance and a principled approach being taken by a level of government like that, it very likely is going to have some impact on how people in other organizations are sort of balancing those competing interests. Another question is, can an employer require disclosure of a positive COVID test after September the 27th? So my view is that it would be largely impossible for an employer to be able to satisfy its obligations under occupational health and safety if it did not require employees to advise it if they did test positive for COVID-19. Again, it's going to depend on the nature of the organization, the level of interaction that your employees have with others. So for example, if you have a worker who is working strictly from home and does not come into the workplace at all, it may not be necessary for that individual to disclose if they have tested positive for COVID-19, because the risk really, of course, deals with transmission. But in most workplaces, if you have individuals who are coming into the workforce, my view is that in order to satisfy your obligations to reduce transmission, you are going to require employees to advise you if they have tested positive for COVID-19 in order to deal with the sick leave issue. I'm just looking at some of these great questions that have come in. So here's a good one. Thank you, Lisa. How do we handle the situation where you have an employee who says, I refuse to come to work because I don't feel safe? So this is an issue that will come up in many workplaces. Particularly, I'm hearing about this situation in workplaces that don't have a mandatory vaccination policy, or who don't have a policy yet that deals with how they're going to handle risks in the workplace. And what this really amounts to from a legal perspective is whether or not this individual is claiming a refusal to work based on occupational health and safety grounds. And we accept in Alberta that individuals are able to refuse to work if they fall into a certain category of risk to health and safety of that individual or to others. The starting point for the analysis there is always going to be, well, what has the employer done already to deal with those risks in the workplace? So you will be looking at your job hazard assessment. What have you done to reduce the risk of transmission? That is going to be a very big piece of the puzzle in determining whether or not the refusal to work by the employee is reasonable or not. And so if you have an individual who says, I'm not coming to work because I don't feel safe, first step, of course, is always to get information from the employee about what the particular concern is, and then to see if there's a way that that concern can be dealt with, educating the employee with the steps that have already been taken. Remember, if the employee, despite all of the great steps that you've taken as set out in your policies and potentially the particular steps that you might take having regard to that particular employee, the remedy that the employee has in that circumstance is either to make a complaint to occupational health and safety. So they may come knocking at your door, and what they're going to want to see is your job hazard assessment dealing with COVID and the ways in which you have tried to deal with the risk of transmission in the workplace. So you'll see a common theme coming back here to your job hazard assessment being sort of the first thing on your to-do list after the webinar. Or they will claim that in the non-unionized sector anyway, that the failure by the employer to take reasonable steps to protect their health and safety is a breach of the employer's implied obligation to do so. And you may have a constructive dismissal claim on your hands, where the employee says, essentially, I've been constructively terminated because the employer has failed to abide by one of its contractual covenants. That's a difficult argument to run. Particularly if you do have a robust policy in your workplace where you can show that you were taking reasonable steps in the circumstances. But those kind of issues have to be taken seriously because of both the regulatory and then the contractual issues that arise. And so, you know, it's not something that you can sort of ignore and simply say, no, everything's fine, you have to come back. You need to be showing what you have done to make sure that you can require or have the information available to you to justify any of the actions that you've taken down the road. So another question, aside from COVID, are there any other communicable illnesses or diseases that should be included in mandatory disclosure of a positive test result? So these would be fairly rare, and frankly, they're simply not issues that have come up very often before COVID, especially in the non-health sector. So typically in the health sector, you will have more robust policies with respect to communicable diseases. In the sector that most individuals are in, which would be non-healthcare sectors, you know, there are many kinds of illnesses that are communicable, like cold, like flu, and no one has ever really drafted something that would require the disclosure of those sorts of things to their employers. But if there may be other ones that you will want to address, and you will have to think through whether or not it is worth doing so in your particular workplace. In most workplaces, frankly, I can't think of very many where you would require that disclosure to the employer. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these policies that need to be put in place dealing with COVID-19, as with any policy that we've recommended over the past 18 months, one of the points that has to be made in the policy is that the employer reserves the right to make changes to it over time. And so you clearly communicate that you're going to be making adjustments to these policies as things change. And so if there are other issues that come up that you think actually presents a risk in your particular workplace, then you could certainly have that set out in your policy through an amendment. All right, let me just find another question here that we have not answered. Christine, I'm not sure if you are going through these with me. Here's one. So there's a question from Jason. Could you please discuss the situation where somebody has symptoms that require them to stay home but otherwise might feel fine? If they have sick leave, is there any obligation to be available from home, or if you are on sick leave? Seems like a lot of different expectations in this regard. Yes, this is absolutely true. So if your policy requires individuals to stay home if they have a certain type of symptom, but otherwise don't feel sick, your policy can talk about the fact that if they, for example, go get a rapid test and they're clear that they can return to the workplace even with that symptom. Common in policies was a distinction between pre-existing symptoms or symptoms that they know relates to another medical issue, for example, seasonal allergies, that can be excluded from the requirement. And then you do have to deal with the issue of if you have sick leave, are they able to access sick leave for that reason? And most of the time, if you're requiring them to stay home because of a particular symptom and you do have a sick leave bank, they would be entitled to use that. But in a particular situation, if the individual says, look, I'm feeling fine, I can definitely do my job, and they can do it from home, then you wouldn't be accessing any sick leave policy anyway. If they can effectively do the job and the employer is prepared to allow them to do that work from home, then they would simply be paid their regular time and they wouldn't be looking at using any sick bank. Sick banks are generally only accessed when they actually can't do the work in question. So Jason, I hope that answered your question, but certainly feel free to follow up with me afterwards if it has not. And then perhaps we have time for one last question, Christine?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we're good for, I'll only need 30 seconds at the end.
Okay, great. So a question from Michael: how should the COVID policy cover specific internal events, staff meetings, social gathering, group training sessions, etc.? So I think the policy, and again, we're talking now not necessarily about a sick leave policy, which we talked about before, but it's sort of your ongoing policy with respect to managing the risks of COVID in the workplace. You can have requirements that individuals would have maximum, numbers in any meeting, or require that individuals maintain distance in the workplace. My view is that the policy should allow you to be fairly nimble. So if you're in a situation where you have a very high vaccination rate in your workplace, if you're at a time when there aren't that many cases circulating in the community, then you may be able to proceed with those kind of meetings or other events as normal. But your policy should specifically say that the employer reserves the right to make modifications to not only to work arrangements, but also to internal meetings and other sorts of meetings as required. And that will give you the policy basis to be able to say the numbers are up. We've had one person who's had symptoms. This meeting is happening remotely, or it's going to be happening in a different way. So we have to be able to move relatively quickly and be nimble in terms of responding to those factors that we talked about earlier in the presentation that sort of underline your approach to how to deal with COVID in the workplace. I apologize to those questions that, or to the people who asked questions we weren't able to get to. I hope that some of this was useful for you, and I'll hand it back to Christine.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, there were a lot of questions. Thanks so much. One thing I'll mention before the notes that I had planned is that a few months ago we did a webinar on mandatory vaccines and on vaccines at the time when I think vaccine rollout was just beginning. That was a complimentary webinar. So when we send out the follow-up email to this webinar, we're going to include a link to that one. Of course, it's a few months old. It's always funny to watch those that are a few months old and things are so different now. But there's great information in there, in that one. And again, you can access it through the link that we send you, or you can find that webinar and all of the other ones we've done on COVID on our YouTube channel. So if you find us on YouTube, you'll find it there. So that will go into more detail. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Again, fantastic questions. If you'd like us to follow up with something specifically about you after today's session, please, very quickly, as I'm giving these final comments, drop a quick note into the Q&A, and so we'll know we can reach out to you after. Or, of course, feel free to reach out to the speakers. Their contact information is available on the slide deck, but also there's a bio section for each of them in the console. A quick reminder, because a couple folks asked, and we did have some latecomers, you have on-demand access to this webinar after it's done. So you just click on the same link that you used to join the webinar in the first place, and you will be right back here, and you'll be able to see the recording. A reminder to download your materials, the PowerPoint slide deck, and the handout that we prepared for you. And finally, we do these webinars because we're trying to provide value. Certainly in the context of COVID, so much has changed so quickly over the last 18 months or so that we found that these webinars were a good way of getting information out to our clients as quickly as we can. But we want to provide value to you when we're doing these. So when you close out the webinar today, a survey will pop up asking for feedback. Please consider providing us with your feedback so that we can make these valuable for you. And pending any, this is my last call to the speakers if there's any other comments. I don't think there are. That's all we have to say. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. Take care and talk soon. Bye-bye.